Hello and welcome back. And today's topic, we are talking about giving and giving back to the church. This is a topic that has been under scrutiny as of lately because a particular high profile pastor went on national television and came against the tithe and giving to the church. And I wanted to discuss this not so much because I wanted to talk about this. I wanted to discuss this because it's in ordinance with today's topic that I wanted to speak on anyway. A few years ago, I remember I was talking to somebody. I had come out of my building, and this particular person that I was familiar with had, we were having conversation. It was a Saturday morning over coffee, and she was making a point of saying that I'm never going to give to XYZ church. If I'm struggling, why should I give to the church? If I'm struggling, why do I need to give my last into the church? If I'm struggling, why should I stretch myself to give to the church? Why should I allow them to take what little I have? Because of the fact that you have to come to the understanding, and that really convicted me an element, not to not give, but to give more. Why did this do so? Because I came to the understanding. A lot of people got it twisted. A lot of people look at giving as, I'm giving to the church. I'm giving to these people. I'm giving to this ministry. I'm giving to the pastor that runs this place. Some of you are. What you are doing is you're doing what you think you're doing. You're giving to that church. You're giving to that ministry. But the actual premise of tithing and giving is not specifically for that purpose. What do you mean? If you read the word says that the people are to give to the church so that the 10% of the tithe can go back into the community that is poor, impoverished, and needy. That is what the church is supposed to be doing. There are some churches that are not doing that. The thing is, you must come into the knowledge and the understanding of what your church is operating in and what your church is operating under. You understand what I'm saying? And because of that understanding, okay, you need to understand, listen, observe. Are you supposed to give your church more? Do I believe there's such a thing as breaking seats? Absolutely. Why? Because I've seen it. I've done it. I'm be honest with you. I have done it. I have given my church $1,000 and seen my season break within a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. I remember one time this was the first seed that I ever gave that had any value. It was a $1,700 seed. I sold it into a church after I met a woman at a church. I came back to their church because the woman had such a heart on her that made me say, I'm going to come back and I'm going to give to this church. I got the money together, came out of the restroom after I had gone to the bathroom, and I handed off the money to the pastors of that church. I didn't know what their need was. I didn't know for what reason, but God knew. And it was funny because a friend of mine had called me. She said, you must give, you need to give, you need to give, you need to give. And 25 minutes she called me and she talked to me about giving. And I was like, okay. And I went to this church only because I ran into this woman about a week before. And her heart was so pure, I wrote her a letter. And I put the seed to the church in that. I gave them the money, and they prayed with me. And I felt blessed in that experience. But beyond that, I had not worked in I don't know how long at that point. Within 3 weeks of me doing that, I got a job. And I worked that job for about 3-4 weeks. It was a temp position. And I had a great experience during that time frame that I was working that position. But my point being is the seed that I sowed to that church, I believe, broken. And it wasn't because I gave the seed to the church. It was because God knew there was a need in that place. And he sent a person to me that he knew that if they said the right thing to me, it would put a check in my spirit that when I got the finances, I would give into their cause. Because it wasn't about giving to the church. It was about the need that was needed behind giving to that church. God will use anyone to give. God's desire is to see his people thrive. God has used me multiple times in that way. And it wasn't always with money. There was a scenario a few years later where, maybe in that same year, was a young woman who came to me. She was homeless, she was hungry, and she's talking about she needed something for her kids. I took her to go get something to eat in the mall, the local mall around where I was living at the time. And she said that her kids needed food. We had an overpopulace of food in the house. And my dad wasn't eating it, I wasn't eating it. So what I did was I packed up the things that I would figure that a child and a family could use and took 2 huge grocery bags of it. Packed it up and took it to the church that night because I was going to prayer service. And I was hoping that the woman showed up. Funny enough, there was another woman that was there. And she was a very loudmouth, what have you person. And I really didn't know what to do. Because the woman didn't show up and I was preparing to leave and I didn't want to carry all that stuff back home. So I turned to her and I said, look, I got all this stuff. I don't want to take it back home. Do you want it? And she turned around and I happened to tell her who it was that I was going to give the food to. And when I told her that, she said, oh my God, that stuff was for my sister's kids. That's my sister you ran into. This food is for us. Thank you. Let me let that sit for a minute. God will use whoever he can in the moment in which they are willing to do. He will stretch you in your ability to give. I did not give anybody any money that day. I gave them food. I carried that food 45 minutes on my shoulders from where I am right now all the way over to the church that I was at. 45 minutes on foot. Exhausted to prayer service to make sure that I could get it to this person because I didn't want those person's children to go hungry. Then I turned around and did the same thing again. There was a family that needed food. And my church deacon said that the people needed food around the corner. So what I did was I packed up another set of food. I met him at the church and gave him the food to give to these. We went over there to give to that family. And I handed it over to them. God will use you in giving in whichever way, and God will bless you in return in the same. If I was ever out of food, I didn't have to worry because I gave so much food. I always got food back. God sees what you do and he gives in return in the same. If you give food, he will give food. If you give money, he will give money. He does exceedingly abundantly greater than you could ask for or think in whichever area and way in which you do it. If you give your time, someone will give their time to you. If you give your advice, he will give someone to give favor and advice back unto you. If you socially take the time out with people, he will give you the people that need you in that time. Sometimes it's not the people that you would want to be around or hang out with, but he is going to give you those people because you are willing to pour into others. He will pour back into you. That's what coaching and consulting and all that kind of stuff is. Giving is more than just money. But money is something that's necessary to give. And it's not about so much, oh, I gave to this church. It's about securing, one, you're giving to the church. Not for the church, but for those that are in need. Now, some people say, well, I'm not going to give to the church. I'll just rather give it to the people that are in need. That is not the principle. You give to the church what belongs to the church. For you are giving God what belongs to God. Now, some might say, well, how do you, because you're giving into his church. The thing is, you need to give into the right churches. Because if you give into the wrong churches, you actually can curse your money. And that's an understanding most people do not have. Some people will find that they are making less money, they aren't getting what they need, they are not doing what's necessary because they are giving into ministries and places and spaces that are operating in the wrong spirit. And if you're doing that, then yes, you're going to stay in poverty. Yes, you're going to stay in situations and spaces that are not of God. And you're going to be wondering why you can't break free, because you are attached to something that is not of God. And I've heard many people say this. They gave into a church, and the way that I've always divinely reversed something like that, as soon as the Lord gave me wisdom as to who was the church or the thing or the place or the space that I gave into that was not of his will, I figured out to tally up about how much money it was that I gave into that church. And I prayed to the Lord that if he gave me the amount, I would in return give it back unto the church that I knew had the right spirit on it, thereby breaking whatever covenant I had to that old situation. And God did it. God did it. With that being said, coming into that knowledge and that understanding that it's not the giving that's the problem. It's the spirit behind the places that you're giving into. I told this story before on here. I was going to a church for a month to get a certain element of anointing the Lord wanted me to get out of that place. But I was not meant to stay there. And just before I left, he gave me a revelation about that church. And I told you this before. I was sitting in the pew in the middle of a service, and I started to go into, like the spiritual blackout that I think it was Paul talked about. And I don't know exactly which chapter it was. Don't get me to lie. When the Lord took him up into a spiritual vision. I went into a spiritual vision. My eyes closed. And I was in the exact same church. When I say this church was pitch black, I mean it was pitch black. There was no windows. No, nothing. I saw nothing. And I did see light. And I'm like, where's this light coming from? Because the whole church was pitch black. Everything looked black. Couldn't see nothing. But there was light reflecting. Where was the light coming from? It felt I could see the fire. Like fire embers reflecting off of this pitch blackness. And I'm like, where is that coming from? Then I looked down. The ground underneath me. I was sitting in the pew, and it was like I was looking through glass, and was completely sitting over fire. It was hell fire. The assumption of what hellfire would look like directly underneath of where I was sitting. It was all over the ground underneath of me. That's where the light was reflecting off of. Some of these churches are operating in the wrong spirit. They are not operating in God's will. They are not operating in God's way. In 2020, when the churches shut down, God was not going to let some of them churches open back up. Not as a physical building. It was not going to happen. Some of them transitioned to online. Some of them will never open again. Why? Because they were operating in the wrong spirit. And I'm going to tell you how I also know that that church was operating wrong. It was a couple of days after I got to that church. And the young woman, I said, what are you doing to help the homeless? She said, if we helped every homeless person that needed help, our church would go broke. When we clearly see in the word that the tithe is for the 10% of the people that need help. The church is meant to help those people with 10%. That 10%, that is what it's for. Yes, there's some for church operations. But there are things that are supposed to be done for the community. Housing, food services, all of these kinds of things that the church needs to be doing. But this church had the audacity to say, if we did that, our church would go broke. My belief is if more churches did all of that, they would thrive and they would never see their doors shut. Because it's not about how many people and how many ways of this, that, and the other. God will pour the people into your church if you are doing His will. But if you are not doing and giving and operating in the right spirit, this is when you will see dwindling numbers. You will see that people will not be there. You will see fights in the church. I remember, I never forget this. I went to visit a church. There was two churches that were across the street from one another. That morning I had went to a service, which I went to the right service. But that afternoon I said, let me go check and see this church over here across the way. This is when they tell you, do not just go and spread yourself and spread your seed all wildly. But I'm glad I went in there, because when I sat down in that church, these people, the people operating the church, had a spirit about them that was so incorrect. They were literally breaking out into arguments and fights in front of the congregation. I was like, I can't believe this. I left the service that evening. I was like, wow. You need to understand who and where you are giving your seed. Because the anointing on that place may be incorrect, and they may not be operating in God. There was a major church I went to. If I told you the name, you would know exactly what it was. The pastor, and I've said this before, the day I was supposed to go into membership for the membership ceremony, a friend of mine said, don't go. And I said, I was confused, because my entire intent, I prayed, I went, I fasted, I did all this before I left here. My target was to go to that church, because I believed that the Lord had shown me that church is the one that I needed to go to from here, and I didn't want to be disobedient. I even had my pastor from this state write a letter to that pastor as a security to make sure that I got into that church. When I got there, when I finally was able to start going to the church, it had a good spirit about it, but something wasn't quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but my friend, she had been there before, and she told me that she had a similar dream scenario as the one that I'd had with the previous church. And I sat with her that morning and did not go to the service that I was supposed to be membershiped in. Later that afternoon, I went to the second service, and I stayed up in the balcony. While I was sitting there, I had another vision about the church. And I saw the pastor with sunken-in eyes, and he was wearing a not really a sombrero, but one of those flat hats. Best example I can give you is when Beyonce was doing the Formation tour, and she had all those black hats that they had that had the flat brim on it. It was exactly like that. He had on one of those hats. I could not understand what I was seeing. I even asked a spiritual friend of mine, a different person, what that world that was. It meant that the pastor was not operating in the spirit of God, and he had lost something in his spirit. You got to be careful who you are sowing into, who you are coming into alignment and covenant with. Not too long after that, I laid on the altar at that church, and the pastor placed his hands on my head and prayed over me. Within 2 weeks, I found my church. That I still to this day watch their ministry, even though I'm not back in New York right now, but I still continue to watch their ministries even from Baltimore, because that church changed my spiritual life, delivered me from a lot of things, and I will continue to sow into that church whenever I have the ability to, because that church blessed me. It restored me in ways. It may not have completely fixed everything, but I can see that the prayers are being prepared to be answered, because I sold into that church. I've sold money into that church. I've given. I've done what was necessary to do. Giving is such an important thing. You must walk with the Lord and use wisdom. God will give you the ability of who you're supposed to sow into, but you have to understand and know how to walk with Him through those places, spaces, and seasons. God will give you wisdom, but you have to walk in clarity. Clarity of God. So my prayer is that you will do and you will walk in wisdom with the Lord. Giving is not something that you should ever take lightly, because it does stretch you. I've heard ministers say they gave $1,000 seeds, $10,000 seeds, $20,000 seeds. It's about where your faith is. Seeds are used to break things. I used to do breaking seeds when I had nothing. I would give pennies, change, dollars, whatever I could get my hands on, because it would be the widow's mite. Because when the widow gave, and she gave all that she had, that was more than any of the other people gave. Because if all I have is $1.20, but that's all I got. You got people that have 10, 20, 100, thousands of dollars, can tap into their bank accounts, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they don't even want to give $100. But yet they want the Lord to bless what they are doing. The tithe is meant to not only help the people, because you give alms to the homeless. That's when you give money, change, and things to the homeless. You give offering to the church. But that 10% protects the rest of your finances from the siphoning spirit having the ability to siphon your money away from you. Every time I get money, I give. Every time I have money, I give. I give at the very least my 10%. Because that secures me in the season. This season I haven't had any money. I've gone a year with no money. But let me tell you this. In the year I went with no money, when I needed something, I had it. God will always make sure that if He is providing for you in a season, you're going to have what you need. There's food in my freezer that was not needed to be paid for. There's clothes on my back that I ain't have to buy. There's money that took care of bills that I needed to pay that someone else took care of right in the nick of time when it needed to be paid, because God had them favor me in that moment, so that thing was taken care of. And why do I believe that happened? Because of all the giving I did in the seasons prior. That's what your giving does. It secures you in the seasons of lack. If you go and read the Bible, and you read about the story of Joseph. Joseph was the dreamer. Joseph went through slavery. He went through all this type of stuff, and then he became the prime minister. He told the Pharaoh in the seasons to come that there would be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of lack. The reason that they were able to make it through the 7 years of lack was because of what they did in the 7 years of plenty. In the time frame in which you have your finances, in which you have an abundance of clothing, in those seasons, that is when you store up. And some people are like, oh, that means I'm supposed to save. Yes, you are supposed to save money in order to help yourself. But you also are supposed to give. Because in your giving, where your money runs out and you are lacking, you will secure yourself. This past year, I have not needed any money. And when I did need, somebody provided. Whether it be my father, whether it be a good friend of mine. I didn't have to ask for nothing. I remember one time I sewed. And I consistently sewed. And so, you know what somebody did for me? For the amount that I sewed, I was given back a check for $5,000. If it was 10% of what I gave, how much did I give? $5,000. 10% of 5. Or shall I say that would have been $5,000 off of $50,000. Yeah. Would have been $50,000, right? Yeah. So you have to come to the understanding that over time, you will see a return. Is that what I gave? Now I feel like I gave $5,000, and I got that $5,000 back. But I know that in tournament, I received $50,000. So I'm not gonna say that I gave $50,000. But I know that the multiplication off of what I gave would be at least $5,000. Now that I do know. But God has a way that He gives to you. I ain't gonna get on here and lie. But I want to make sure I calculated that right, and I believe that I've given at least $5,000 over the years. Now, if I gave $50,000, that would be a shock to me. But I know I calculated at the utmost. I know I have given between $5,000 and $10,000 that I can calculate. Now, maybe it was somewhere else that I did not recognize, but I know that amount came back to me. $5,000 came back to me. What you give, you will receive back unto you, multiplied, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. Sometimes you might not get it all at the same time, but you get it when you need it. At the times I got that $5,000, I needed it. I used that money to get myself in order in certain ways. I used it for business related expenses. I used it for taking care of my day-to-day. I used it for getting myself in order with my credit. I used it, so I was smart with my money. But sometimes you just end up in a season of drought, and it's not because the enemy is siphoning you, yet he will in those seasons. But the Lord is showing, let me provide for you. And because you trusted Him with your seed in previous seasons, He's going to bless you in these seasons. So with that being said, I hope this talk blessed you. This is Taj McCameron for the ministry. Until next time, much love, faith, peace, and blessings. Bye-bye.